All right, everyone. In the interest of time, we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us today. Today's topic for RetailX is fundraising in the current environment. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sapna Shah. I'm the founder of RetailX. I'm an angel investor. I focus on the future of retail at the pre-seed stage. Today's session, like all of these kinds of sessions, will be recorded and go up on the RetailX series YouTube channel. So if you have to leave early or you missed part of it or you just want to see it again because it was just that good, please feel free to find it on the RetailX series YouTube channel. We will start off with about half an hour of a moderated discussion. The rest of the time is for your Q&A. So as you think of questions, you can put them in the chat now, or you can put them in the chat as we get to the end. For everyone who's on this call, afterwards, you will be invited to the RetailX Slack channel, which has a number of resources and a kind of a great group, as well as be put on the mailing list for future sessions. So without any further ado, my guest today is Aubrey Pagano from Corigin Ventures. Aubrey, why don't you introduce yourself, give us a little bit of your background, tell us about Corigin and your role and focus area.
Cool. Okay, I will. Hi, everyone. Excited to be on this with you guys. And Sapna, thanks for inviting me to come on and speak to everyone. I'll give you guys a little bit of my background about Corigin, and then I'll sort of take you back in time, in the before time. So I'm the newest partner at Corigin. I've been there about 6 months. And what Corigin does is we're a seed stage fund in New York that focuses on businesses that are using technology to reshape the real world. So that's a pretty broad range of things, but we really focus on the people, places, and processes where maybe traditionally something was happening IRL, and then technology has been used to kind of exponentially empower that system or that process. And so there's 3 of us that are partners, and we all have kind of sweet spots that we invest in. I focus on all things consumer, anything in the sort of female consumer and femtech space. Virtual communities, which I'll get into my background, but I built a pretty large virtual community. And then anything around sustainable supply chain or global commerce infrastructure is also an area that is near and dear to my heart. And my background before this, and sort of the reason those areas make sense for me, the firm also invests in marketplaces, B2B marketplaces, family tech, prop tech. We have a large real estate background and one of our founders as well. So to give you guys a sense of that. And then, so moving backwards, the reason why that area is specific to me is before this, and actually how I met Sapna originally, we met, I feel like at Le Pon Quotidien, I think, near Grand. Right. I think was one of the first times we met, sort of one of those, friend of a friend intros. But I was at the time building a company called Bow and Drape, which was an e-commerce company focused on reinventing customization for women's fashion. So, there's sort of janky screen printed t-shirts online, and then there's really bespoke things, and there was sort of nothing in the middle. So we were almost like a masstige brand for apparel and accessories that were more customized. So we built that brand online. We then eventually, took that brand offline and scaled it omni-channel to over 300 department stores, shop and shops, pop-ups. We raised venture capital, we raised debt, and then we got the company profitable and then sold it to a private equity firm last year. And so it's always funny to say it in such a short window because it was 7 years of my life, but had sort of been through the ringer, and through that process had started to do some small investing out of a group called X Factor Ventures, which was spun out of Flybridge, which focuses on female operators investing in other female operators. And that was where I really got excited about investing. I kind of sworn it off in a way because I was raising sort of pre-Me Too and had some pretty bad experiences raising. And then I actually got really energized when I started investing, was wow, I have a lot of empathy and connection with these founders. I like watching people go from 0 to 1. And I feel like I could actually be a good actor in the environment. And so that's why when I was sort of on the literal and metaphorical beach figuring out what I wanted to do next, I got really excited about joining Corigin. And then the last thing I'll say about Corigin is specifically when I say we lead seed, we write, that's typically $500 to $1 million checks into companies that are typically post-launch, but sort of pre-fully scaling out product market fit to give everybody a sense of where we're at. So that's me.
Awesome, thank you. That was a great intro. I want to jump right into things. Most of the companies in the sort of the retail community are mostly at pre-seed, some are at seed. I think the number one question on all of their minds is, can pre-seed and seed companies raise a round right now in this environment? What do you think?
So I think absolutely they can. I think there's lots of qualifiers to that though. So I think if you asked me maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago, I would have said, let's wait and see. So I think there was what you saw at the beginning of March and through sort of mid-June was people were sort of on pause. Largely VCs were just looking internally at their own portfolio and saying, okay, let's triage, like who has runway, who doesn't, who's at risk, who's not, and let's like shore the people up who we need to shore up. And so I think there was this pause across companies and VC. And then what we've seen is deal flow start to pick back up after that. And we've actively invested. We've done 3 deals in the time of COVID. So they're definitely active investors. And I would say there's a couple considerations. I'll say a couple on the VC side that you need to think about as a founder, and then a couple on the as your own business side. So as a startup founder. So on the VC side, a couple things to think about that I think are definitely things that I didn't appreciate as much when I was a founder. One is you want to think about the life cycle of the VCs you're pitching and their fund. So if somebody has just closed a fund or they're freshly deploying capital, like they're out there needing to write checks. And for a lot of people, this is a real opportunity moment for them because there's a lot of people that are at the cusp of reshaping industries sort of post-COVID. And so it's important to know that versus, let's say someone was gonna go out to raise this summer. Now that venture capitalists, who their investors are LPs are sort of, pumping the brakes a little bit. That venture capitalist might be trying to spread out their investments a little longer and potentially holding off on writing new checks. So you can sort of scratch under the surface and like get at that when you're meeting with VCs to understand where they're at in their life cycle. And then also knowing what their focus areas are. Some VCs are unafraid of real estate right now or anything that's sort of in person. Others are shying away from it. So you can get a sense from their, follow their Twitter accounts, follow their blogs, understand their point of view on those things. It'll help you gauge sort of who to pitch and who's investing where. And then on the startup side, I think the bar is still, there's still lots of capital out in the market. Like at the later stages of the market, we've seen a slowdown. I think it's yet to be seen in Q3 what'll happen at the sort of seed stage, but capital is fairly commoditized still, and there's lots of money out there. So I think you absolutely can raise, but I think as a startup, what I would have told myself in the rearview mirror is just, like I said, make sure that you have alignment with the venture firms that you're pitching to. So, make sure that they're interested in your industry, given everything that's happened with retail, with hospitality, with DTC brands. Like there are some people who have just sort of said no, and there are some people who have said yes, but, and some people who that's just their, like Coefficient is a great one where they're just like investing in brands. Like that's what they do all day. And so, should reach out to them versus maybe some more generalist funds where they're feeling a little bit gun shy. So I think my overall lesson is, do your homework a little bit, but people are absolutely still writing checks. We see companies, I still get to invest out of X Factor, which is pretty awesome. And I just invested in a company called Ceremonia, which is a Hispanic hair care brand that's C2C. I'd known the founder forever. She was like one of our influencers at Bow and Drape. She was like head of partnerships at Uber, and like I just believed a lot in her. And so I think those deals are definitely, and that round was oversubscribed. So I think they're still getting done. It's just you have to really like know your audience in a way.
And is it taking longer to get these rounds done now, in your opinion? I think from what I've seen on the pre-seed side, particularly in consumer, like D2C brands, it feels like at Precede, at least, it is taking a bit longer to get the deals done.
Yeah, I think what we've seen is it's taking, especially in the rearview mirror, given the slowdown over the last couple months, it has been taking longer. And then what we've also seen is it takes longer if you want to command still a high valuation. So what we've seen is actually valuations, especially on the consumer retail side, come down 20 to 30%, and that those deals oftentimes get done a little faster. But yeah, I think, I always tell people, like, assume it's going to take 6 months to like raise your round. And I think that, if it happens sooner, in 3 months, you've done a good job. But I think particularly in this environment, assuming that it's, if you're starting to raise now, assuming it's going to take through the end of the year.
I mean, you and I were just also talking about right before we had everybody come into the room that, if there is like a second wave and another lockdown, do you need to be in the city and those sorts of things? But if there is another second wave, do you see kind of that pause happening again on the VC side? Like people are saying November, maybe the winter will slow down. Like, should you raise now because people are deploying capital? Or if you could wait a little bit, should you wait? Or is there so much more uncertainty if you wait that you should not wait at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have been advising our portfolio companies is make sure that you have runway through the end of Q1 next year. Mm-hmm. So that I think is number one triage, is like, raising or not, make sure that you can tighten the belt so much so that you have a little bit of optionality, because I think there's two more inflection points that we see, potentially three. So one is we see that sort of like getting back to school. What's going to happen when people go back to school? And is there going to be a wave then? The second sort of lesser one that we're thinking about is the election. And then the third is, assuming we get past the second wave, assuming things start to go back to normal, like, what does Q1 look like? Because a lot of people that we are seeing are saying we're going out to raise Q1 2021. Like, that's like the time that everybody is saying. And so I think there's going to be a big buildup and backlog around that time. And so I think being able to weather all of that is what we tell people first. And so then I think individually, if it's like, you got to raise now to make sure that you like have that runway, then do it. If you can wait, we also have seen, if you can wait, it's so funny because so much of like early stage comes down to like your burn and cash management. But like we saw a company that does cart optimizations, or a supply chain company that helps you kind of manage in-cart experiences and add on to post-cart purchasing. That company has been doing so well enough that they're like, actually, we don't want to risk it and raise right now. Like, we can get to break even ourselves, be a little bit scrappier, and then go out and raise Q2 next year. And they're like, we want to get through all this. We want to be scrappy now so that then we can be in the clear. So I know that's, I wish there were a more prescriptive answer, but I really think it comes down to like, can you get through this uncertainty? And then also, is your business kind of unfazed by this? We have a company that delivers school lunches. Like, they need to make sure that they can get through this school year. Some people may be a little bit more shielded from that.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say end of Q1, because I think where I've been hearing a lot of founders say, I have runway till the end of the year. And I was like, well, then you got to start raising now, right? Because if it's taking you 6 months. But then they push back with, I thought you're not supposed to raise in July and August, because that historically people have not raised in July and August. I don't know about you, Aubrey, but I'm not really going anywhere. I'm still home working in August.
Anywhere. I just think the whole like work-life balance, like this, it's a blip. Like, it just, I feel like those rules go out the window a little bit this year. Maybe people will take a couple of days off before school starts, but I think people are still working, and the traditional like July and August, everybody's away. I feel like I've been working harder than I have in other parts of the year, just because everyone's home and there's like a very thin to no line between like working and having dinner. So So I would say I wouldn't be daunted by that. I think people are writing checks, and no one's going to like Croatia to go sail right now.
I don't think Croatia's letting Americans in right now. So what do you see happening? You mentioned, if your valuation is kind of the 20 to 30% lower right now, your round will get done faster. What do you see, particularly for pre-seed and seed? How do you see that trend over like the next 12 months? Do you think this is more of a blip? Are you, what's Corigin planning? Are you planning that valuations kind of will come down and sort of stay down for a bit? Or is this just like a little trough?
It's a good question. I think there's been a long-term shift, depending on what type of business you're talking about. If you're talking about an inventory-based retail business, I think there is a longer-term shift in the way that venture capitalists are thinking about those digitally native brands. And I don't think that is going anywhere. Like, we've seen valuations go from a typical seed, maybe valuation would be between $6 and $8 million in terms of total valuation. Like, we've seen that in some cases get cut in half. And I think the reality of that is that if you think about the venture math, like, what we have to justify for ourselves is that we need to, because what we have seen, and we did at Corigin, we actually did a little bit of inside analysis on this. I looked at the top 50 companies that had exited in the digitally native brand space over the last 10 years. And what you actually see is that the average range, even on the top 50, top 10 of those companies, is typically around they're maxing out at between 150 and 300 million, and max multiple they're getting is 3 to 4x. And so as a venture fund, you have to kind of back into that and say, okay, if this is going to be a fund returner for me, like, how much percentage of it do I have to own at pre-seed or seed? And the answer, I think, is more. Like, I think, you have to believe that digitally native brands can be really capital efficient and that they don't spend all their venture dollars on inventory. And then you have to believe that you can maintain, because they're capital efficient, you can maintain a larger ownership stake than you would in, let's say, a SaaS company, so that when that company exits, necessarily not at like $3 billion, that you can have still a return that's worthwhile for your fund. So I think people have like started to do that math in the background. And so I think that's pulled valuations down, but I think appetite is still there. I think for other things around retail enablement, supply chain, anything that's more tech and asset light, I think valuations have, I think they can, as long as the economy doesn't tank, I think they'll remain sort of where they were pre-COVID.
Yeah, I think that was really helpful. And I'm really glad you split those up, because I think that digitally native brand valuation shift was already happening pre-COVID. You were already starting to see that the exits were not the same as sort of tech exits, right? And so I feel like this maybe just accelerated it a little bit, or at least made it a broader based understanding for a lot of people, and certainly for founders.
Totally. No, totally. I mean, I think you saw it with, I think it started really hitting, I think you saw it most publicly with WeWork and Casper, and a way, like, after all of that started to happen, brandless, like, I think that's when it really started to hit the market.
Yeah, for sure. Have the metrics, so you talked about like the ownership kind of at early stages, but have the metrics you're looking for, particularly at seed, because I think one of the questions, at pre-seed, you tend not to have a lot of metrics, but one of the questions I get a lot from this group is, what metrics do I need to actually raise seed? And have those changed now because of the changing environment?
I don't think so. Like, I think what I always tell founders, because there's no like silver bullet metric, but I think in your business, there has to be some standout metric that gets investors excited. So whether that is, we looked at, there was an appliance company that was doing air conditioners and dehumidifiers and all this stuff, where like their early traction was like the AOV was like close to $1,000, right? Like on first purchase. Like, that's a standout metric. Most retail, you don't get that high of a purchase. Or we looked at a retinol company where after 8 months, the retention was above 50%. Like that's a standout cohort retention. And so I think it's really about that. It's like, you don't need, we don't expect, $10 million of run rate at seed. We don't expect, 3% returns, but we expect that if you're building early product market fit, if you have an MVP, if you have early tests, that like you have proven out something special about your business in that small cohort that you have. And so that's really what we're looking for. We're looking for companies that are either super sticky with their customer base. We're looking for a company that has a super engaged customer base, because I think now more than ever, people have been talking about it forever, but we really see community and commerce coming together, like community being the new acquisition channel, because like Facebook has like no arbitrage left. Or sort of similar, really high margins or AOV that necessitates that can afford a higher acquisition cost. Like those are the things that we're looking for in an early business. And that's also something startups should be looking for. Like when I was starting my company, like we had kind of so metrics until we raised our seed. And then we had one product, which ended up being this like sparkly sweatshirt that like people started, coming back and buying within 2 months, like some for their friend. Like it was like the data went off the charts, where it was like, okay, there's clearly something special here, and the data showed it. So that would be my advice is think about how you can show that with your early customers, that there's something really stand out about your business, versus trying to like optimize for all these different metrics.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I've never really used those words, like one standout metric, but I think I'm going to completely steal that from you and use it in the future. Mm-hmm. So I hope you haven't like trademarked it or something, but, but I think it is hard, because I think, I think at the early stages, founders are thinking like, oh, I have to have X level of revenue, I have to have X level of retention, I have to have this AOV, I have to have this number of B2B clients. Like they're looking for like the one, the one number in each category that gets you over the hump. And I think the way you're talking about it feels much more doable and less overwhelming in some ways. So I appreciate that. Okay, so we've all now been working virtually for, I feel like it's forever, but it's probably only been like 4.5 months. I think a lot of what used to be the case, particularly at these early stages, is these in-person meetings with founders, right? And really getting to know people and having a coffee and meeting them multiple times. And now that's happening all over Zoom. When hopefully we'll have face-to-face meetings soon, but until then, kind of what are the tips you have for founders to sort of manage through that? I know some investors have been very honest and have said, if I can't meet you in person, I just don't know if I can write the check. Where others have invested in the past without ever, physically meeting in person. And what advice do you have for founders on that front?
Yeah. Overall, I would say same thing that I was sort of harping on before, is just like do your homework first, before you invest too much time in someone, to know what their stance is. We are fine writing checks remotely, and we're a pretty remote young team. And so we're okay with that. But I think there's a couple things you can do. So one, I actually think this is a moment, traditionally, I think a lot of VCs like companies where you have a co-founder, at least, a 2-person team. But I think as a solo founder, this is actually an advantageous moment, because something that we find is it's actually really hard for us in our sort of virtual boardroom to gauge co-founder dynamics. Like we have a really hard time being like, okay, we can't tell like who talks over who, do they, who's the alpha? Like there's all these things that you get, all these other signals you get in person that really help us. And so it's been easier in some regard when we've seen solo founders to write those checks. So that's one thing I would say. And then if you are a team, think about how you can showcase that to the investor. Like I would also put that back on teams that have multiple founders to say, like, how can you show your interaction? Like I just met with a team where they were just really seamless, where like, you take this one, I take this one. Like it was very clear that they like knew how to interact on Zoom together. And it made me feel a lot of confidence that they could collaborate virtually. So I'd say think about that. And then the other thing I've started to do sparingly is that I live in Brooklyn. And so there've been some entrepreneurs who have been like, I will come to Brooklyn. I live right by McCarran. They're like, I will bring you a coffee in McCarran Park. We can like have a social distance walk and like we can meet in person. And so I think I'm not saying everybody signed up to do that. I'm more so saying like, if you have a relationship with a founder or with a VC, to me, it shows like a lot of tenacity to try and come meet me where I am. And so I think obviously, you know, you have to be careful with what people are comfortable with. I'm comfortable with a mask on doing a socially distanced walk, but I think in ways that you can replicate the in-person experience, you know, I've heard people be like, I'll send like, you know, a VR headset, I'll send you a care, you know, people in advance being like, let me send you a care package and a video. Like, I think get creative about the ways that you can try to replicate the in-person experience, I think would be beneficial.
Yeah, that's really helpful and really good advice. And I think that the sending things is really interesting, right? Because being able to, particularly for founders with a physical product, being able to touch and feel it, if it's not something ginormous like a mattress, you know, it is kind of helpful before you have the conversation. You at least have a sense of a little bit more where normally you would have just brought samples to the meeting, right? So that is really helpful. Okay, I have one last question for you before we move to audience Q&A. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you can put it into the chat. I see there's a few already. And then we'll go through them in a minute. So what if you're, and this is particularly for pre-seed companies, what if you're just really early, you're having trouble raising, you are not finding kind of those investors, and then pre-seed, you're looking mostly at angels, right? But there are pre-seed funds. And you just can't raise. What do you do?
I mean, so I think there's a couple things, you know. One, I think for everyone, it's important to like, and we see this also as fund managers, we see like first time funds, you know, LPs give us the same advice, which is like, look yourself in the mirror and like, make sure that this is the thing you can be doing best right now for yourself. So like, I think before thinking about all the really like nitty gritty, like scrappy things you can do, I also think it's a good time to be honest with yourself and say, should I be like going to do something else for a year? If I'm hitting a wall, should I be, I just think it's an important thing to acknowledge, because I think so often people think that that's failing. And like, I think running yourself into the ground, stressing out about how to get something off the ground, where if you could have just like salvaged that time, taken a breather, and then come back next year with like new energy, like that might be the right option for some people. So I acknowledge that, because you know, some people just like burn out during these times, and your mental health is important. Beyond that though, you know, I think it's really a time to be, like I was saying, super scrappy. So I think there are more scrappy channels that people can explore. And I think the fact that everyone is virtual gives some sort of like arbitrage, especially on the community side. So what I've seen some companies do is really leverage interesting in-person moments and interesting virtual moments to build their community and build their credibility as they're raising. So there was a company, actually a cereal company of all things, that was looking at launch. They were waiting to see if they should launch. And through all the Black Lives Matter protests, they actually started these little roving carts for protesters where they had branded cereal that people could munch on. They had like snacks. They made it a very branded moment. And for that company, you know, it made sense, a very progressive brand to like be aligned with that cause anyway. and they got, they got their round done through that time. They got, I think, good credibility from their community. And that's, that's them sort of thinking on their feet. Like, that's probably not what was in the roadmap for launching. But I thought was a really good example of them trying to be scrappy and sort of roll with the punches a little bit. And so I think for companies that are hitting, sort of like hitting that proverbial wall, I think, scrapping the playbook a little bit and being like, okay, well, how can we take advantage of this moment is another interesting option. But beyond that, I mean, I wish I had a quick, like, sometimes it's just hard. Sometimes you just have to go at it. And the other thing I would say is, like, I always thought of raising like following, like unweaving a tapestry thread by thread. And so it's like you would hit a wall because you'd go through like 5 or 6 meetings and like not get anything from anyone. And then it was like that 6th meeting where you're like, I've been doing meetings for weeks and like nobody's hit. This one person's like, you should talk to my friend. And then like that magic happens where they're like, oh, I love this, I'll invest, let me bring this other person in. So I would say, keep unraveling that tapestry and sort of pulling at those threads, especially during this time. Because oftentimes, I think you really have to run it. Like, I stopped fundraising when there was literally no one else to talk to. Like, like I had a spreadsheet of like 200 angels, so I just share that because, and not to say that's not what people are doing, but sometimes the answer is like beyond even where you think it's going to be.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And let's move to the audience questions. I'll read them out so that everyone sees them and hears them and it works for the recording. From the first questions from Taylor. At what point do new businesses start to consider reaching out for investment? I started 3 months ago and started taking sales 2 weeks before that. Am I looking at 6 months out, a year out, or a certain revenue threshold?
So, I think so there's a couple things to weigh in terms of when to raise. So the first thing to consider is your bank account. So it's like, how much money do you have in your bank account? How long can you sustain your business before you run out of gas? Like, startup is a race against time and cash in the bank. So I think that's the first thing to think about. The second then is, it sounds like in particular, Taylor, your post revenue, but oftentimes, especially for seed, we like to see early traction and early revenue. So that's another marker of a company going out to raise, is like, can you show in some way that you have paying customers and that they like your product? So one is paying customers, and the second is that they like your product. Going back to that comment about metrics, like, can you show in those first couple months live or weeks live, can you show some early excitement from your customers? High NPS, like quick reordering, high AOV, like some of those things that I talked about. I think that will also give you an indication of whether you want to go out and raise. And obviously, the earlier you can get those numbers exciting, the better. But beyond that, ultimately, you as a founder know best, and your own momentum. Like part of being an early founder is you kind of create your own momentum, and that's like the sales side. But then the other is like, you have to know the data and like know what's really there. And so I think it's a combination of looking at your runway and knowing if you think you're on the path to product market fit. And then, like I said, budgeting in for that like 6-month raise. And then that's, to me, like the magic formula for when you should go out. I don't know if that's helpful. It's not super specific, but.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Armin. Do you have an opinion on equity crowdfunding for pre-seed or seed D2C/digital native brands? Are there any platforms for crowdfunding that you respect more than others?
It's a good question. Yeah, generally I think they're good if they can work for the company. I think the ones that help, so I'll say a couple things. I think mostly for crowdfunding, the truth sort of behind the curtain is that they take a lot of effort. So a a lot of the crowdfunding platforms will, you can talk to them early about how they're going to market you, how they're going to message you in their email blasts, if they're going to feature you. But a lot of it is sort of you as the founder taking advantage of the network and doing active outreach. So I think part of that trade-off is like, do you have the bandwidth to actually do all that outreach and all that marketing on the platform yourself? Because that usually leads to a more successful outcome. Sometimes I think it ends up being a little bit of wasted energy if you just kind of plop yourself on the platform and just like expect people to come to you. But otherwise, I think crowdfunding platforms are, a fine source of capital, especially the ones, there are some that will aggregate everyone into like a single line on your cap table, which simplifies things for other institutional investors. And so, yeah, so I think, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it can be really advantageous for a company. I think probably the one that I have seen the most is Circle Up. I think they've done a pretty good job as a marketplace. And then obviously I think Kickstarter's not really crowdfunding. I guess it kind of is, but Kickstarter is obviously one that I think for very specific functional products that are sort of like tech widgets, I think that actually is a really successful channel. Like I actually did a Kickstarter for my business that was successfully funded, but was really hard. Like I don't think it's good for apparel lifestyle. Like I think it's almost like the as seen on TV stuff. If you have any product like that, I would actually recommend Kickstarter. I think that's a great way to go.
Great. Next question is, are you seeing lower ad costs in your portfolio companies?
This is a good question. It has been all over the place. So it's been kind of like, it went like this. So, and especially depending on your sector. So at first they were rising. Then at the beginning of COVID, it was through the floor. Like it was so cheap. And then we started to see things tick back up again. So we've actually seen ad costs start to rise again over the last 4 weeks. And specifically for anything around what we call vices or household care. So anything that I would encompass in like the homebody economy. So like people trying to survive at home in COVID. So vices are like CBD, alcohol delivery, like anything around like sex, like all that stuff has started to rise again, and it has had a huge windfall. And then any, household cleaning products, online grocer, all that we've seen rise a lot. Anything around apparel, accessories, all that has started to rise, but because that category has been overall hit, like we haven't seen those ad dollars rise as much. I think partially too because there's like, the big guys aren't, there's Neiman Marcus and Bloomies and all those guys are in hot water. So.
Yeah. Great. Next question is from Thorn. In what ways are you ladies being inclusive to Black people in the industry, parentheses, offering resources, hiring? Please give examples.
Sure. So actually, we just announced this week, which I'm really excited about. We at Corigin have a new sort of diversity initiative that we launched. So probably the bright line of that is that we are committing of our own GP capital, $2.5 million to back Black and Hispanic GPs. So if anybody out there knows any money managers that are specifically Black, we have a list of about 35 that we've gotten so far that are raising. We as a team really believe that in backing Black investors, we can do a lot to evolve the industry. One is having diverse decision makers at the table really affects the outcomes of what gets funded. So we really believe in having, diverse voices around the table. The second is what we've seen, and it's been written about somewhat, is that there's a pipeline issue in venture, similar to the way that there is with women, there also is with other minority or underrepresented groups, is that it's not like there's like all these Black partners just like waiting for jobs. Like we need to sort of build up a pipeline of talented investors. And so part of us backing Black GPs is that we can sort of help them build a track record, help them break into the industry. And And then also through them, we can hopefully gain access to their networks and their talent and their deal flow. And so we hope it's beneficial, but that's what we're really excited about doing. And so, yeah, so those are the main things that we're doing there. And then also being transparent about our data. That's the last thing I would say. Both across X Factor and Corigin, we are openly and transparently talking about where we're at. We're at like 46% of our last fund was underrepresented groups, and then 8.6% of our portfolio was Black or Latinx founders. And so we want to raise those numbers to be at least 50% and 15% respectively. So I think also having like an open dialogue about like, here's where we're at, here's how we want to be better, and making that like an active part of the conversation is another way we want to push the industry forward.
Amazing. I did see the announcement about all of that earlier this week, right? It was, or last week?
Earlier this week. We had a busy week.
Yeah, that's so great. And Thorn, because you said ladies, I will also address this issue. So I've been very clear about my investment focus is on women and underrepresented founders. Over 85% of my portfolio has a woman or underrepresented founder on the co-founding team. I prefer that to be in the CEO position. I think at this point, I have investments in 4 companies with a Black founder. And I'm continuing to maintain that mission. So one of the things I try to do in RetailX over time, which I hope everybody has noticed, is I try to keep I definitely don't do manels of male panels. And I love that word. And I try to keep a very diverse and representative group of speakers. Obviously in this fireside chat format, it's one at a time. When we used to do them in real life, we would have very diverse panels. But Thorn, thank you for that question. Next question from Brian.
Thorn asked the link. If you go onto Corigin Ventures Medium page, or if you just Google Corigin Ventures diversity, like all that will come up.
Oh yeah, perfect, thank you. Next question from Brian. You said money is essentially commoditized these days. Does that mean competition will heat up amongst investors for access, or are the number of opportunities still so plentiful that there's more than enough to go around?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the way that we have seen it over the last couple of years is that there is essentially like a supply side problem. Like there's just so much capital in the market. So we've seen there's traditionally, right, there was like ABC, then we saw, 5 or 10 years ago, seed came into play. Now there's a bunch of pre-seed companies. And now what we see is that A, B, big multi-stage growth funds are putting money into seed and pre-seed to gain early access to deals that they want to lead later on, or they want first look at the A. And so what that translates to is, because there's been more money than ever put into venture, like as an asset class, that there is, for the best deals, there is fierce competition. And that is also why we've seen over the last couple of years valuations rise, especially for the cream of the crop, deals. We've seen, when I was raising, a big seed was like, $500,000 to $1 million. Now a seed is between $1.5 and $3 million. An A, when I was raising an A, was like $3 to $6 million. Now an A is like $10 million plus. Like, it's really, I think part of that is sort of the cram down from so much money sort of staying in the private market, and the lack of IPOs. So I think you see that for the most competitive deals. I think it's still always hard. I think the thing about venture and the nature of the business is pretty opaque, and it's very relationship and network driven. And so I think depending on where you sit in the industry, you may not feel that it actually is that way. But I think what will end up happening over time, I'm actually not, that's like a whole, I could go into like a 10-minute thing of like where I think venture is going to go. But I think eventually that will likely swing back to the middle. Like, I think we sort of saw this incredible boom. I think the way that the economy is going, the way that COVID is happening, the sort of the exits that we've seen happen, especially in, you know, sectors like consumer, I think things will swing back a little bit toward the, you know, less of the balloon that has happened, and hopefully that balloon doesn't pop. But I guess that's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Great. From James, can you speak a bit more about community as the new acquisition channel and your interest in virtual community? I actually love this question. I love this whole space.
Yeah, no, me too. Yeah, thanks for this question. So so the context is, you know, over the last 10 years, 10 years ago, social media was this sort of new frontier, this new ad frontier, where you could go onto Facebook, you could go onto Instagram or Snap, you could come up with some really kind of cheeky content moment and acquire people either for free or very cheaply. As that ecosystem has evolved, and as just generally the ad ecosystem has evolved, it's really expensive to acquire customers, especially at scale. You end up, there's always a breaking point where things start to get less and less efficient and your acquisition costs start to rise and rise and rise. And so what we see as or at least what I see as the antidote to that is that, and I'll add, the other is that, you know, there was a huge amount of discovery happening over the last, again, call it 5 to 10 years, where, you know, you could use influencers to help with discovery. You could pay people to sort of advocate for your product. I think the consumer has gotten really smart to that and tired of that. You know, the consumer can see when the Kardashians are pushing sort of teddy bear hair gummies that that's not an authentic product to them. And the consumer has more choice than ever. And so what we have seen that traditionally started out as what people would consider like a non-scalable acquisition channel in community, we've seen the really great brands build authentic community first and then monetize that community after. And so, so I can give a couple examples. So one company that I just invested in is called Lex. So they're a social app for the queer community. They started on Instagram as sort of like a lo-fi personal ad that you could post $5 and you got your personal ad, you know, posted to this group. The community itself raised a Kickstarter of almost $50,000 to fund an MVP app. The founders used that money to build the app and launch it. Over 4 months, the app had hundreds of thousands of downloads, you know, tens of thousands of monthly active and daily active users, and just like this rabid fan base who started using it for all different kinds of things, for dating, for housing, for job opportunities, for advice, for meetups, for protests. And so to me, it was almost like they have, you know, they have reached the point at which, like, they're, oh, sorry, can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
My Teams just popped, my Microsoft Teams just popped up. Oh, don't get me started on Microsoft.
Whole other conversation.
What do they want? But I was gonna say they have, I think they cracked the nut on, now they have this really captive audience that they can build tech and product around. You know, that now they can go to any retailer and build a product partnership. Now they can start to charge for things that the community is already doing. So, you know, I've seen a couple instances that there's a dog food company that started to build community by going around to dog parks and playing with dogs and giving free samples. And so that's how they built their acquisition. So I think it's sort of like a duh thing to be like, oh, right, like you need authentic community and that hand-to-hand combat. But I think if you can do it digitally, there's like a big unlock for acquisition.
Yeah, and I would I feel like I was not paid to promote this, but if you want to hear more about some great thoughts and examples on how community leads to commerce, you should follow Web Smith on Twitter and sign up for his newsletter, which is amazing and has a tremendous amount about this in there with many, many more examples. That was just a little unpaid shout out to Web. Okay, the next question is from Michael. Aubrey, where do you see venture going? What are your thoughts on revenue-based investing like indie VC?
Oh yeah. So I think it's pretty cool. So there's a lot of these sort of revenue-based investing models or alternative investing models pop up. And it's early. So, I think I can't speak to the caliber of the fund managers themselves and how like efficacious they'll be in helping. But for a long time, as I as I grew up in the industry and got more jaded in the industry, we've talked for a long time about how venture investing doesn't serve every company. And there are lots of there's sort of like a graveyard of companies that were overcapitalized or incentives weren't aligned with their board, where they could have been really standout companies had they been capitalized in a more aligned fashion. And so to me, revenue-based investing is an alternative to that, where if you have a handle on your cash cycles and you have a handle on, if I put X amount in and spend X amount of marketing, I'm going to get X amount out in a certain amount of period, there is no reason why you should, give up like expensive equity for that, for funding your inventory and for growing your brand. And so I think revenue-based investing creates a really great alternative to that, where incentives are aligned, where the investors are sort of giving you money up front and they're sort of like taking back business, or you're taking money off the table as the business grows. And so I think for inventory-based businesses, it's really interesting. I think for businesses with sort of predictable models, whether that's subscription commerce or somebody who's figured out a predictive acquisition model, I think it's a really great alternative. So, but I think it's early days. Like there's probably maybe over just the last year or two, there have been some of these who've gained a lot of traction. So I would just say, do your homework on them. But I do think it's a really great alternative when you're thinking about where to take money from.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question is, what advice do you have for solo founders that are fundraising?
Such a
broad question.
If you're a solo founder, explain why you are and explain who you have lined up to complement you around the table. I don't think you need to necessarily have co-founders, but I think a solo founder needs to show, hey, I have XYZ person from Tesla coming on to be my engineer. I have XYZ person from Facebook coming on to like run my ad sales, whatever it is. Show that you know how to build and lead a team, that you're a fair leader, you can gather the right amount of talent. Usually with co-founders, there's one person who was like the original idea person and someone who got brought on. So I think replicating that story and showing how you're building your executive team is important.
Yeah, and this might not have been where you were going with this, Armin, but the other thing I would say is, and I have a number of solo founders in my portfolio, is that if you're a solo founder, find an investor, a mentor, a advisor, somebody who can like help you like just bounce things off of. And I think that is, I tend to do that at the earliest stages with a lot of, with actually, I think every solo founder in my portfolio is I'm the person who gets the call when they don't know what to do next, or if there's an HR issue or whatever. It's just, I think for your mental health, it's really great to have somebody to bounce things off of. And so if you have at least one person in your network who can be that person, you will be a much happier person.
That's such a good point. And the other thing I would say to that too is it's like, don't rely on your team for that. I think it creates a weird dynamic if you're like right hand, you're like who's not an equity owner is hearing about your issues that keep you up at night.
Or if you can afford it, hire a coach, which I think is great for actually all founders, whether you're solo or not, particularly for co-founders. Actually, coaches are great. And I know sometimes that's very unaffordable in the early days, but if you can afford it, definitely do it.
We had one. It's saved our marriage.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that is all the questions we have, which is perfect because that is all the time we have. So, Aubrey, thank you so much. Can't thank you enough. This was wonderful. Thank you for sharing kind of your experience and your take on things and what's happening currently. Thank you, all of you who are in the audience. Thanks for coming. We have a session next week on how to build a brand from scratch with Rushi Roy, the founder of Aubrie. That's next Thursday at 1 o'clock, same time. So I hope to see you there. Like I said in the beginning, you'll end up on the RetailX email list. I promise you I won't spam you. And you'll get an invite to the Slack community. More information, resources, and my open office hours are on the RetailX series website if you want to have more time with me. Look forward to seeing everyone next week. And thank you again, Aubrey.
Awesome. Yeah, it was great talking. Thanks to everyone for their time.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.